In this lecture, we'll be examining Ohio during the Second World War. The image on this slide is of Bofors guns produced at the Firestone Tire and Rubber Plant in Akron in April of 1944. These were anti-aircraft weapons used by the Army and the Navy during the Second World War. As always, let's start with our guiding questions. What roles did Ohio and Ohioans play in the Second World War? And how was Ohio affected by the Second World War? Throughout the decade of the 1940s, Ohio politics was dominated by the Republican Party. This reflects in part a streak of fiscal conservatism in the state's political history from the 1920s through the present day. Even many Democratic politicians found that being a budget hawk was good politics. No politician was more influential in Ohio politics than Robert A. Taft. If you've heard the name before, you might know he was the son of former President and Chief Justice William Howard Taft. His son, Robert A. Taft's son, was Robert Taft Jr., who was in the House from 1965 to 71, in the Senate from 71 to 76. His grandson, Robert Alphonso Bob Taft III, was governor of Ohio from 1999 to 2007. Robert A. Taft served as one of Ohio's U.S. senators from 1939 to 1953. He ran for president 3 times, and he made his name as an ardent opponent of FDR's New Deal. Early on, Taft was an isolationist and an outspoken opponent of World War II. This view aligned with many conservative Ohioans who did not want a repeat of the horrors of war and the war experienced 2 decades prior in the First World War. Taft opposed the Lend-Lease legislation FDR developed in order to aid Great Britain early in the war. Taft famously said that, quote, "Lending war equipment is a good deal like lending chewing gum. You certainly don't want the same gum back." That's a dead-on impersonation, by the way. He sounds just like that. Taft argued that the 1940 election was a referendum by Americans to stay out of the war in Europe, since both FDR and Republican Wendell Willkie both promised neutrality. Lend-Lease, according to Taft, was an escalation of hostilities that would drag America into the widening war, although his isolationism did end after the attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. John W. Bricker was a Republican who served as Ohio's governor for the entirety of the Second World War. His time as governor found him responsible for eliminating a state budget deficit, though his administration also simultaneously increased public school funding. He created a 2,200-member state guard to replace the National Guard, which had been called to duty during the war. Bricker was the first Republican-elected governor 3 consecutive terms, and he was the Republican nominee for vice president in 1944 with Republican candidate Wendell Willkie. Bricker later served in the U.S. Senate from 1947 to 1959. Ohio leaders created an entity known as the State Council of National Defense. This was a group of political, educational, and business leaders whose goal was to coordinate war efforts in Ohio. Economic and security sectors such as civil defense, industrial production, agricultural production, labor relations, workplace training, finance, housing, and health fell under the council's oversight, so in short, much of the economy. During the war, unemployment in Ohio disappeared almost overnight, and there were shortages of labor. The number of industrial workers rapidly expanded from 750,000 workers to 1.2 million workers in just 18 months. After the war, the network established by the council helped foster greater connections between business, national defense, and universities. As you can see on this slide, major cities in Ohio raked in tremendous amounts of money via federal contracts. Ohio was fourth in the nation at $18 billion in contracts. Ohio businesses profited. Ohio farmers profited. Ohio workers, not so much. Wage controls and commodity shortages made life for industrial workers at this time less than ideal. Also, when the United States entered the war, the leaders of both the AFL and CIO pledged that there should be no strikes or walkouts during the duration of the war. While there were a few wildcat strikes, walkouts and strikes in general were limited until after the war. Ohio's wartime industry grew rapidly as revenue from federal contracts arrived. The image on this slide is of workers at the Goodyear plant in Akron assembling a Corsair, which was an important carrier-based fighter bomber of the Second World War. There was great growth in Ohio manufacturing in the 1940s due to wartime spending. Wages and personal income rose steadily, but there were housing shortages and rationing of goods. Families faced stress from military deployments, and industrial work schedules could be at any point in the 24-hour day since many plants operated around the clock to meet demand. Divorce rates rose during the decade, and although suicide rates declined from the 1930s, they were still high by comparison to the present day. Labor conflicts were relatively constant, with 467 Ohio work stoppages during the war, even with pledges from the main unions to ban strikes. A behind-the-scenes player in Ohio's war effort was the Battelle Memorial Institute. This is a private, non-profit applied science and technology development company. Battelle is based in Columbus. It was founded in 1923, and laboratory operations began in 1929 in a building next to Ohio State University. Gordon Battelle, the Institute's founder, inherited a lot of money from his father's steel business, and he, in turn, invested in lead mining and smelting businesses that made even more money. Battelle was fascinated with applied research to solve problems. This was really forward-thinking and not typical for the time period. In terms of war-related achievements by Battelle Memorial Institute, its researchers developed the first fuel rods for nuclear reactors. Another group invented the first commercial xerography equipment that we today know as Xerox. Battelle engineers designed advanced armor plating for tanks, as well as the first optical digital recorder, a sort of precursor to CDs and DVDs. Battelle is still around today, and it has an annual budget of over $6 billion. I should note that conspiracy theorists obsess about BMI, and you can find Battelle associated with all sorts of crazy ideas if you go searching on the internet, but I won't be using this video to amplify insanity or stupidity. Another example of the industrial role of Ohio in the war was the Goodyear Aircraft Corporation in Akron. This was a subsidiary of the tire company that began in 1917 as Goodyear Zeppelin Company. As Zeppelins were used in World War I to spy and to drop bombs. You can see an image here of Zeppelins above the former Goodyear aircraft hangar in Akron. In World War II, the company manufactured parts for the B-26 Marauder, a medium bomber. It also produced thousands of FG-1D Corsair fighter bombers. I'll show you that in a second. Later, the company became Goodyear Aerospace in the 60s up until the merger mania of the 80s. Then it was sold to a company called Loral, L-O-R-A-L, which then sold that division to Lockheed Martin, and it's absorbed by that conglomerate these days. So I mentioned the Goodyear FG-1D Corsair a second ago. This plane was the premier Navy and Marine fighter of World War II. The Corsair is credited with turning the tide of the Pacific Air War by overwhelming the once dreaded Japanese Zero fighter, outclassing the Zero in many performance categories, with the exception of maneuverability while in high speed. But it was able to climb to higher altitudes than the Zero at a faster rate. And in that particular phase of the war, getting altitude meant you had the advantage. To illustrate its value in the war, the Corsair racked up an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. Corsairs were also used as fighter bombers near the end of the war and into the Korean War. One of the innovations, and you can sort of see it in this picture, is the bent wing design, which allowed for shorter landings. It also had stronger landing gear to allow for better carrier landings. Yet another important contribution of Ohio during World War II was the Dayton Project, which was part of the Manhattan Project, the top secret program to build nuclear weapons. Initially, it was created with engineers from Monsanto. Yes, that same Monsanto that genetically modified food opponents despise so much. Hundreds of professors, graduate students, and industrial chemists from universities and laboratories in the state and region worked on the Dayton Project. After the project was completed, the research facility was so contaminated with radioactivity it was dismantled and buried in Oakwood, Tennessee. Among the Dayton Project innovations, the group developed the neutron initiator. Its role was to kickstart a chain reaction in a nuclear bomb at a precise moment. And I'm hoping my GIF works on the next slide. With the initiator design, a conventional explosive produces a shock wave. The initiator is at the center of the plutonium pit. A beryllium pellet hits a polonium initiator, which triggers a chain reaction in the plutonium core. This was a key component of the first nuclear bombs the United States produced. 3, 2, 1, boom! Just had to say that. I used to do sound effects with these lectures, but then I had somebody with PTSD get freaked out by it, rightly so. So I don't do that anymore. The invention of synthetic rubber has been described as the second most important innovation of the war. The image on this slide dates to February 1942. It shows a synthetic rubber, or Ameripol was the trade name, worker on a tank at the Akron plant of B.F. Goodrich. Akron was the center of the project due to the presence of tire companies and the University of Akron. Today, we might not appreciate the problems associated with the supply of rubber because we're used to a world in which synthetic rubber is all over the place. The committee in charge of securing rubber supplies during the war noted that it was used for many products, but at the time, especially tires, belts, and hoses for vehicles and aircraft. And the committee members wrote that if we fail to secure quickly a large new rubber supply, our war effort and our domestic economy will both collapse. The biggest advances were polyvinyl chloride, which we today know as PVC, and styrene butadiene rubber, SBR, or synthetic rubber. By 1944, a total of 50 factories were manufacturing synthetic rubber. To put that in scale, the volume of synthetic rubber by the end of the war, synthetic rubber, was 2 times the world's pre-war natural rubber supply. That's just amazing in 4 short years. closer to BGSU, the village of Luckey, Ohio in Wood County played an important role in the war effort. During World War II, a company called National Lead produced magnesium under contract from the United States government, used in things like tracer rounds and certain types of engine components. The Atomic Energy Commission reopened the site as a beryllium production facility. Brush Beryllium Company produced beryllium pebbles, beryllium oxide, and beryllium hydroxide. These products were used for various nuclear projects. However, the waste solutions and sludge were stored on plant property in lagoons about 4 feet deep on approximately 40 acres of land in Luckey. It is still a toxic waste site, and it will be decades before remediation is complete. There are a number of contaminants on the site. There's beryllium. There's several radioactive isotopes, including uranium-238 and radium-226, plus various heavy metals. And even though it's close to BGSU, do not go there and poke around. There are cyclone fences with barbed wire marking off the area. And I say this because I had a student a couple of years ago not only write about the plant and the waste site for the class, but actually hopped the fence with a camera and took a bunch of pictures. I mean, he's very proud of it, but I was aghast that one of my students put himself at risk of heavy metal or radioactive particle risk. The iconic Jeep was produced for the war at the Willys-Overland plant in North Toledo. Willys-Overland also shared the Jeep design with Ford, and some say they stole it from a company called Bantam, but Bantam couldn't scale up production fast enough, so the federal government kind of took the plans and passed them around. Jeep remains a popular brand name. Jeep vehicles continue to be produced in Toledo as of this video, which is produced in 2020. During the war, in the 4 years of the war, over 300,000 Jeeps were produced by Willys-Overland. Built in 1942, the Cleveland Bomber Plant was owned by the Department of Defense during the Second World War. General Motors operated the facility and manufactured the B-29 bomber there. The image on this slide features women assembling wing flaps for the B-29, and this image underscores the contributions made by Ohio women on the industrial home front. By 1945, women made up a greater share than ever of the civilian workforce up to that point, but some of these gains vanished post-war, with returning soldiers reclaiming places in the civilian workforce. Back to the plant. Later it was named the Cleveland Tank Plant, and the plant during the Cold War at its peak employed 15,000 workers, many of whom lived in housing projects in the immediate neighborhood. The plant did development work on the XP-75 long-range fighter as well as light tanks. By the end of the war, over 30% of Ohio's industrial workers were women. Generally, they worked semi-skilled positions. Daycare centers emerged in Ohio in this time period to accommodate the needs of women in the workforce. Women with children often worked night shifts. Interestingly, shopping hours began to be extended during this time period to accommodate women in the workforce. Prior to the war, most retail businesses closed at 5 or 6 p.m. But women were paid significantly less than men for doing the same work. And that's still an issue in 2020, the last time I checked. But the discrepancy was much greater. Also, many unions refused to allow women to join. Married women were also expected to take care of the home and the children. Labor shortages meant new opportunities for African Americans in Ohio. Some businesses and unions ended discrimination voluntarily, while others were forced to do so as part of federal contracts. But discrimination remained. Pay was unequal, harassment was fairly common, and promotions were rare in industrial settings. The formation of the Vanguard League and the Future Outlook League helped break down some of these barriers of discrimination and segregation, but it would not be until the civil rights movement hit its peak in the 1960s that significant legislation would be put in place to, at least in a legal sense, end discrimination. World War II temporarily ended the woes of Ohio farmers. Demand for foodstuffs soared. Associated with the rising demand was a reduction in agricultural surpluses and an increase in prices. The Emergency Price Control Act of 1942 guaranteed 90% of price parity on crops like corn, cotton, wheat, rice, and tobacco for 2 years after the war's end. Cotton and tobacco weren't grown in Ohio. Well, a little bit of tobacco was grown in extreme southern Ohio. The goals of this policy were to rein in inflation and to prevent a post-war recession. The guaranteed price supports in 1942 have been extended numerous times into the present day, although the amounts have varied. The immediate effect, though, for Ohio farmers was financial security. Farm income in the war years steadily increased. Farm income benefited from these government policies and overseas demand. Of course, this came after poor decades for Ohio farmers in the 1920s and the 1930s. Farm productivity was improved by mechanization, which meant less labor was needed to produce the same amount of crops. It became possible eventually for fewer workers in Ohio to exceed the state's agricultural output of earlier years. By 1945, Ohio farmers were purchasing specialized equipment like twine binders, self-propelled combines, corn pickers, tractors, and threshers. The increase in tractors led to a decline in the number of draft horses used by farmers. Fewer horses needed meant that land once set aside for animals to forage would be turned over to other agricultural purposes. In the decade of the 1940s alone, 2.5 million new acres of Ohio farmland became available for crop or livestock production that had been set aside for animals' forage food. There were a number of other changes for Ohio farmers in the 1940s. Rural regions experienced a growth in electrification, which was a means to boost profits by powering milk coolers and feed grinders and heating systems. By 1945, Ohio had more electrified farms than anywhere in the United States. That sounds like a great band name, by the way, the Electrified Farms. By 1948, 97.6% of Ohio farms were electrified, a rate 21% above the national average. Ohioans served with valor during the Second World War in the armed services. Over 800,000 Ohioans served in military units, which represented about 12% of the population. 50,000 of these Ohio military personnel were African Americans. A total of 23,000 Ohioans lost their lives or were missing in action during the war. There were major weapons arsenals in Rossford, Marion, Lima, Columbus, and Ravenna. Major tank plants were built in Lima and Brook Park. On a side note, the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the first atomic bomb over the city of Hiroshima, Japan, was piloted by He was an Ohioan in the second half of his life. He was born, I think, in Illinois, but we're claiming him. There was a brief but sharp recession immediately following the war, but the GI Bill helped transition from a wartime economy to a consumer economy. By 1947, armed forces levels had dropped by 90%. The GI Bill guaranteed a year of unemployment compensation. It made available low-interest home loans, loans for farms and businesses, and also tuition reimbursement at $500 per year, which is probably in the neighborhood of $6,000 to $7,000 in 2020 dollars. But that doesn't factor into account, and that doesn't take into account rather the fact that college education itself is higher than it has ever been proportionally in the economy. So if I were to convert that $6,000, I would probably double it, $12,000. You could get a decent education in 2020 on $12,000 a year, especially if you went to a school near where you lived. I digress. There was significant growth in union membership during the war. 36% of industrial workers were unionized in Ohio by 1945. In the year 1946, there were over 5,000 strikes in the United States. This reflected the backlog from the war years, plus discontent with falling wages after the war. But economic growth began in 1947, largely driven by housing starts, or the new construction, as well as consumer spending. Let's talk briefly about the so-called fat years of Ohio manufacturing from 1950 to 67. We're dating this. Smaller producers had gone bankrupt or exited auto production, leaving only 4 large domestic manufacturers of automobiles. And since most of the largest competitors in the automobile industry were located in Europe or Japan, auto imports in 1950 accounted for less than 10% of sales. So most of the American automobile market, at a time when Americans were seeing incomes rise, was dominated by the big 4: GM, Ford, Chrysler, and American Motors. Despite rising wages, though, industrial profitability was still above the rate for U.S. manufacturing. That's Ohio industrial profitability. There was growth in the sectors of aircraft, automobiles, rubber, and appliances in Ohio. U.S. companies established a strong presence in Europe and Latin America, and exports during this time period helped keep a very vigorous American economy going. Per capita income rose steadily in Ohio in the decade of the 1950s. Per capita income in Ohio also, as you can note, exceeded the U.S. average throughout the decade. You can see from this chart that Ohio population growth rebounded after the dip during the Great Depression. There was a new trend of people moving to suburbs after World War II. And there were 2 groups really that contributed to much of the population growth in Ohio after 1940. The first of these migrating groups were poor whites from Appalachian regions. Kentucky and West Virginia were the biggest origins of these people in Ohio. Dayton and Cincinnati were the destination of many Kentucky immigrants, while migrants from West Virginia primarily relocated to the cities of Akron, Cleveland, and Youngstown. By the 1970s, 1/3 of Ohio industrial workers were Appalachian in origin. There were numerous cultural changes. Country and folk music arrived with these people, and radio stations began to pop up that played country music in a way that had not been the case prior to the 1940s. Dwight Yoakam, for example, the country star, moved from Kentucky to Columbus in the 1950s. In addition, many more Southern Baptist and Pentecostal churches were founded in Ohio in the period from 1940 to 1970. reflecting this migration. And I also am the product of Appalachian migration, although my father's father moved from Western Virginia to Detroit, but we were part of, my ancestors were part of that. And if I haven't said this before, I'll say it in this video. My dad was born in a very small town in Western Virginia, not West Virginia, but the far, far Western Virginia, almost into Kentucky. And the name of his town, I'll even throw this as an extra credit question on the quiz for those of you who've stuck around this long, was Appalachia, Virginia. Was it worth the wait? It don't get more Appalachian than Appalachia, Virginia. Look it up on Wikipedia if you doubt the veracity of the existence of this town. You can't doubt me because I've been there. I've taken photos. Finally, African American migration to Ohio grew significantly during the Second World War and the decades after. So you've heard of the term the Great Migration before. Maybe you've heard of the term. But I like to split it up, and many scholars do as well, into the first and second Great Migrations. Because during the Great Depression, there wasn't a lot of migration south to northern industrial cities or Midwestern industrial cities because there weren't any jobs. The first Great Migration centered on the First World War and the Roaring 20s, so 1910 to 1930. About 1.5 million African Americans from the South moved mostly to northern industrial cities. The second Great Migration, 1940 to 1970, you had about 5 million African Americans moved to a variety of places. They moved north, they moved Midwest and the far west, including many to California, where cities offered skilled jobs in the defense industry. About 500,000 Black Ohioans can traced their migration to this time period. The African American population demonstrated much higher growth in cities than in rural areas. Black Ohioans came from a variety of southern states. Most came primarily for employment opportunities in Ohio factories. I know there's a I don't want to say myth, there's a belief, collective belief that Black Ohioans came seeking a better environment for their families, and it was important to African Americans moving to Ohio. Unfortunately, many Black Ohioans found that segregation and discrimination in the Buckeye State could be as pervasive as in the South. It wasn't a welcoming place, as we talked about during the lecture on the Ku Klux Klan. Conditions would not improve until in a legal sense, until the civil rights movement kicked into high gear in the 1950s and 60s. But even into 2020, discrimination remains an issue. Harassment and sometimes racial violence erupts. And cities like Cleveland are still quite segregated. This draws to a close our look at Ohio during the Second World War. Thank you for sticking around for a video that has crossed the 30-minute mark, and I promise the remaining videos will not be this lengthy. Have a great day.